welcome back to I messed up. Okay, I messed up that intro. Anyways, it's me, your boy Blue Getsuga, and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier analysis video. And today I'll be talking about Springgans and Dinoruffias. I mean, obviously I'm going to be talking about Punk and Beat Troopers too, but that's for another video. Anyways, let's get started. First off, we have Springgans, and Springgans are an Xyz-based archetype that is mixed in with the whole Dogmatica lore, and that's all. And that's all I would really have to say to, I guess, summarize. I guess speaking is very hard to do today. To summarize the themes of this archetype. So let's get started. For the pros, this deck has good boss monsters, to say the least. Their boss monsters aren't particularly broken or ridiculously powerful, but they're pretty good. This deck also has decent recovery because of your field spell, you can basically just spit out another one of your boss monsters with relative ease, and on top of that, the Springgans allow you to reload your Xyz monsters with fresh Xyz material. And these Xyz monsters can just bounce on and off the board. So at some point you would snowball advantage pretty easily. This deck has decent defenses because Springan Booty as well as Gold Garganda. When your Xyz monster just basically leaps out the way, which they almost always do, you can basically just target a monster on the field. They can't activate their effects, and on top of that, they can't attack. You may think, hey, that's pretty lackluster. Well, because it is. But it does help. It does help a certain amount, and also it does help interrupt your opponent and prevent OTKs. And this deck is also fairly consistent. Also, I forgot to mention the Xyz monster, as well as some of the main deck Springgans, they have a lot of defense. So there's that. This deck is also pretty consistent because there's tons of ways to get your Gold Garganda, because this deck is essentially Gold Garganda the deck. Because you have your Springan Swatch, which allows you to search Gold Garganda, and if you already have Gold Garganda, it can also help you set up even more of your Springan plays. And you also have Springan Booty, which basically allows you to activate Gold Garganda from your deck. So you basically have 9 copies of Gold Garganda, and if you want, you can also play Pot of Extravagance. I think that's the name of the card, which is basically a better Pot of Duality. And you can play that and increase your chances of getting to your Gold Garganda. And for the cons, their attachment effects aren't quick effects, and fun fact, if any of you guys have seen my Springgans duel video, I probably deleted it. But if it's still on, or at least if you've seen it, you would know that I made the mistake of attaching the Springgans to my Xyz monsters as quick effects when it turns out I couldn't do that. So there's that, which is kind of bad, but it's not too big of an issue. The second con being that this deck lives and dies off of Gold Garganda, meaning if your opponent gets rid of it, there isn't really much you can do. MST is surprisingly so good against this deck, because you get rid of their Gold Garganda and you get rid of their Xyz monster, which isn't too hard to do, and your opponent's just stuck there essentially. Also, this deck cannot OTK unless someone has discovered something that I don't know about. But from my experience, this deck can't really put out that much damage in a single turn. Because when I played this deck and even facing this deck was pretty easy. And playing this deck was I want to say very hard, because again, I kind of treated the attachment effects as quick effects even when I couldn't. Yeah, it was still pretty difficult to actually play with this deck. Or I guess I should be like, I guess the more accurate thing to say is it was pretty difficult to actually try to do that much damage in a single turn with this deck. So there's that, and this deck cannot play through multiple disruptions. This deck is pretty it's very simple. And I guess like as far as like defenses go, I forgot about the Springgans captain. Like it's like he's a pretty standard combo. I mean, I use the word combo very loosely. You basically summon your X-Blower, and then you try to somehow manage to get your Springgans captain onto the field. So basically, you could just detach an Xyz material and just on your opponent's turn just pop things, which is pretty cool. And he also has like I think he has 2600 defense, which is pretty nice. But that's just about it as far as like building boards. I guess your defenses as well as like your traps. Like your trap cards, those work. Also, I forgot to mention that this deck has good spells and traps. So let me add that real quick. Because one of the traps is basically called the Haunted. Like two of the spells being Gold Garganda. I mean, not two, three. Springgans Watch and Booty all being good cards, in my opinion. As well as, like, another one of the traps, I think, being, like... I don't know how to explain it. Like, again, speaking and remembering. One's called the Haunted. One's almost like a breakthrough skill. And I think one of them was like spot removal. Was spot removal that like specifically affects zones. So this deck can also just dabble around and play around with a bunch of traps. So that's also one of the reasons why I say that this deck also has like great defenses. And I'm already fumbling a lot through this video, but let's continue. For power, I'd give this deck a 2.5 out of 5. This deck can't really deliver that much damage. I should say that this deck has like a power of 2 out of 5. But I guess you could argue that this deck's defense is so good that you could say that its defense also counts as an offense, because like I mentioned, you have your Springgans captain, you can basically apply pressure, and because of Gold Garganda, you can constantly hop back into the duel as long as you have means of summoning your X-Blower or any of your Springgans Xyz, which you only have 2 of, by the way. You can basically just stay in the duel and not worry about running out of resources all that often. And because your X-Blower keeps dodging and coming back onto the field, like you could basically get out multiples of your X-Blower, and if that happens, you can basically pop so many things your opponent controls, as well as keep dodging until you mass enough monsters to where you can actually do a considerable amount of damage to your opponent. But obviously that's going to take turns to do. So there's that. For defense, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. I mean, I already explained why when I did power. But again, let's continue. For recovery, I give this deck a 3 out of 5 because, like I mentioned, Gold Garganda basically keeps you in the duel. It's not like Gold Garganda isn't broken, nor is the Springgans strategy broken. Like, it basically just keeps you in the duel in case you survive. So that's about it. And for versatility, I'd give it a 1.5 out of 5 because this deck, it just likes popping things. And I guess you have like a piece of monster negate in the form of a trap card. That's about it as far as versatility goes. Not to mention this deck, like I mentioned, only has like 2 Xyz monsters, the main one being Explorer. And also, another thing I didn't realize, this deck doesn't really work that well with Albaz support, even though a lot of their cards list and specifically lists Albaz, which is kind of infuriating, because I also realized that on top of me accidentally cheating with applying the attachment effects as quick effects, it turns out the Albaz cards kind of conflict with the archetype, kinda. Also, for consistency, I'd also give this deck a 3.5 out of 5. Because, like I mentioned, this deck can very easily get to their gold Garganda, since you essentially have 9 copies, as well as, like, you can potentially run cards like Pot of Extravagance, so you can search out any of your gold Garganda searchers. So there's also that. And overall, I'd say that this deck is a tier 3 deck. I was contemplating on whether or not I should say it's a tier 3.5 deck, but if it wasn't for like the amount of like defensive tactics they had, I would say that this deck would be even lower. Possibly even lower, like I would say possibly weaker and lower than Dino Rustlers, and that's kind of sad, to be completely honest. Anyways, next we're going to be talking about Dinoruffias. And Dinoruffias, they're a new archetype that came out in the most recent set. The most recent set whose name I already forgot. Yay. Anyways, Dinoruffias, they're an interesting dinosaur deck. They're fusion based and they have a very weird playstyle. So for the pros, they have good monsters, which isn't really saying much. They basically have like 4 monsters, and all of them and all 4 are pretty good. So take that as you will. This deck also has great. I don't know why I put spells slash traps. They don't have any spell cards. They don't. They only have traps. This deck has really great traps because a lot of the traps are not only recyclable, but they can also be used again through Kendrigina, your boss monster, as well as the fact that some of the traps can also help trigger your main deck Dinoruffias effects, thus allowing your Dinoruffias to float constantly. So there's also that. This deck is consistent because this deck is a dinosaur deck. You can basically run 3 Fossil Dig. You can also run like Pot of Extravagance. Hell, you can even run like 3 Trap Tricks so you can get to your Dinoruffias domain as quickly as possible. So basically, you essentially have like about 9 copies of your Dinoruffias domain, as well as like 15 copies of your main deck Dinoruffias monsters. So there's that. This deck can float because the main deck monsters, as well as like the extra deck monsters, with the exception of Kendrigina, they can all float. Wait, what am I saying? All of them float, including Kendrigina. Oh, it seems I can't speak or read today. Yeah, they all float, essentially, and a lot of your trap cards basically allow you to float harder while also disrupting your opponent. And I think, if I remember correctly, one of the trap cards is basically non-targeting destruction that also allows your Dinoruffias to float, which is pretty nice. This deck has decent recovery because all it takes is usually 1 card, like 1 or 2 cards to actually get back into the game with this deck. Especially if you have a Dinoruffias monster on the field, you can just basically float further into your deck. And on top of that, the trap cards even allow you to live longer despite cutting your life points in half multiple times. And I'm not sure if the mic heard my stomach grumble. Or I guess growl. Growl would be the correct word. But anyways. The traps in this deck, despite cutting your life points in half constantly, They do allow you to save yourself because they have graveyard effects to protect you from battle damage as well as effect damage, which is pretty nice. This deck has these. Oh yeah, I already read that part. Whoops. This deck has decent dinosaur support to work with, like in the form of Fossil Day. You have your one Misk. Again, Misk should not have been limited, in my opinion. As well as like I've seen like Dinoruffias builds with running 3 Oviraptor, your Misk, as well as like several other dinosaur stuff. Like I personally wouldn't do that, but those are builds you can use. But anyways, for the cons, this deck is really masochistic and risky because, like I mentioned, you like to cut your life points in half all the time for some reason, and all it takes is like your opponent to just get a basically like a well-directed attack at your life points, and it's kind of over. Luckily, like I mentioned, traps can protect you, but you can't rely heavily on those. And on top of that, if your opponent does manage to push through, that's kind of it. So there's that. Also, this deck is mostly good going first, because going second, like it's very difficult because you basically need to set up your board before you can actually get into the game. But like I mentioned, with the dinosaur support, like the Oviraptors and Conductors, maybe you can actually do a little more. But overall, going second is basically just an uphill battle. They're essentially like Altergeist in that sense. Hell, actually, both this deck and Altergeist are heavy trap decks. And lastly, this deck can't really go through multiple interruptions. Mostly going second, like I mentioned. Going first, you can essentially do a lot of things. If they stop your trap card, you can float. If they stop one of your trap cards, you can activate another one. Excuse me. And on top of that, this whole deck's win condition is basically summoning out Kendrigina, and if you didn't know what Kendrigina does, she can essentially copy the effects of any trap except a counter trap in your graveyard. I mean, not any trap, it has to be a Dinoruffias trap, of course. And with that, you can essentially reuse an effect again. So she's essentially like a Dark Lord monster, but for Dinoruffias. So for power, I'm giving this deck a 2.5 out of 5 because just like with Springgans, this deck isn't really going to be closing out games all that much. And if you want to say, hey, what about Kendrigina's attack? Well, if you use Kendrigina, like, if you do the Dinoruffias, the usual Dinoruffias play, you would have the other Dinoruffias, which basically makes it so you can't have your life points anymore, which on paper sounds pretty nice, but then when you think about Kendrigina, you can't have your life points anymore, even if you want to have your life points even further. So sometimes the Kendrigina is just stuck at 2,000 attack, which kind of blows. But the other boss monster is still pretty much worth summoning because it could also just burn your opponent for a lot of life points, which, by the way, when I was actually testing out this deck, I kind of forgot, like I kept forgetting about that effect, and there was basically multiple turns I could have actually beat my opponent. I mean, I still ended up winning in the end, but still, there was multiple times I could have beaten my opponent, but I kept forgetting about that effect. So, aside from the burn damage, Kendrigina is not really all that reliable when it comes to power. But this deck can do a decent amount of damage, as well as, provide a decent offense in the form of your trap cards. For defense, I'd give this deck a 4 out of 5. This deck has a lot of traps, they have a lot of floating, and despite the fact that despite the ironic fact that you're basically just essentially stabbing yourself like twice, just so you could play, just so you can even use your deck. This deck does have a lot of ways to actually try to keep you safe, like in the form of your trap cards. Most notably, I think it's like the counter traps that prevent battle damage. I could be wrong, and because they're counter traps, I guess your opponent can't negate them outside of using counter traps themselves. And they also protect you from effect damage. But aside from your trap cards, you basically also have the floatiness of your monsters as well as the traps themselves while on field, so they can provide interruption to prevent your opponent from actually delivering the final blow, essentially. For recovery, I'd give this deck a 3.5 out of 5 because, like I mentioned, they can float a lot. And on top of that, a lot of your, I think, your main deck, the main deck one, basically allows you to, the main deck Dinoruffias monsters, one basically allows you to set a Dinoruffias trap from your deck straight onto the field, so it could be anything. Oh, which I also forgot is like another copy of Dinoruffias Domain. So you have 12 copies, but then when you also consider Fossil Dig, searching your Dinoruffias monster, that's almost like 15. Yeah, there's almost like 15 different copies of Dinoruffias Domain you have in your deck. And that's also assuming you aren't running Pot of Extravagance. So yeah, this deck has a lot of ways to get back into the game, especially if you have multiple traps in the graveyard. You can basically use them to protect yourself, or you can use Kentrigina to copy their effects to, push to further apply pressure on your opponent. This deck has alright versatility because their traps can do a lot of things, from non-targeting destruction to negation to battle disruption to oh yes, I think even spell and trap negation, which is we need more spell and trap negation in the game, or at least built into certain archetypes. I think they're pretty neat. And for consistency, I'd give this deck a 4 out of 5 because, like I mentioned, you have so many copies of your domain in your deck, and you have so many ways to get to domain, as well as your other traps, essentially. So you can just basically set up a board on your first turn. Good luck trying to do that on your second turn. So overall, I'd give this deck a tier 2.5. I'd give this deck a tier 2.5 because it's not bad enough to be a tier 3 deck, but I can't really see this deck exactly beating a bunch of tier 2 decks, but I could see them competing fairly well against them, as well as a bunch of tier 1 decks. I wish Konami actually, I wish to see more support come out for Dinoruffias because they're a pretty fun deck and they're also pretty powerful and they have a lot of potential. And for all I know, I could be wrong about it. I could be wrong about this deck, and this deck can actually be a tier 2 deck. It could be a strong tier 2 competitor. But anyways, tell me what you guys think about Dinoruffias and Springgans. And it's been me, your boy Blue Getsuga. Also, don't forget, because YouTube pulled the scumbag move and removed the dislikes, especially removed the dislikes when you log into your YouTube account. Because before it was just that you couldn't see the dislikes when you logged out, but now they made it so you couldn't see the dislikes when you logged in either. So if you want to dislike the video, create a comment saying like this comment to dislike and like that comment. But anyways, it's been me, your boy Blue Getsuga, and I'm out.